This particular video will be examining science from a philosophical perspective. Going to be looking at the past few hundred years and what the high points were from the perspective of philosophy as far as science is concerned. There's some very interesting thoughts here that have a lot of explanatory power for the way that science progresses as a field, be it an individual subfield or the gestalt of science overall. There are a couple of reasons why I've decided to start a series about science off with this particular perspective. The first reason is that as a trans woman on YouTube, I'm contractually obligated to have at least one piece of content relating to philosophy specifically. I figured I'd just get mine out of the way early. Another is that philosophy really gets at why science proceeds the way it does on a granular level, in a way that science just doesn't in a metatextual sense. And I think if you really want to understand science from a 10,000-foot view, philosophy is the way to go. Before I can start talking about where philosophy and science intersect, I need to do a short primer on logic. Generally speaking, in philosophical circles, there are two main forms of logic: deductive and inductive. Deductive logic is the sort of logic which is built together by a list of premises, and each premise builds on top of each other to lead to a conclusion. The definition of deductive logic includes the caveat that if every premise is true and they're linked to each other appropriately, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. So a really simplified example of deductive logic would be something like premise 1, if it is raining, then the streets are wet. Premise 2, it is raining. Conclusion, the streets are wet. Now, if it's the case that both of those premises are true, then it must absolutely be the case that the conclusion is also true. You can't have them tied together and both correct without the street being wet. Now, I alluded to these earlier when I was setting up the definition of deductive logic, but the two big pitfalls are that the premises can be linked to each other incorrectly, or the premises themselves can be untrue. You could imagine me setting up the argument so that the second premise, instead of it being "it is raining," had been something akin to "cheddar cheese is a common side to nachos." Now, that might be true, and the first premise would still be true. That being said, they don't link to each other in any meaningful way, and therefore you can't draw a conclusion from them. It's an easy enough pitfall to avoid, just don't put a non sequitur in the middle of your argument. The other large pitfall with deductive logic is the truth of its premises. Take that first premise. If it is raining, then the streets are wet. While that's generally the case, I'm sure that we could spitball quite a number of exceptions to that just right now. What if it was the case that the cloud cover was really patchy that day and that segment of street stayed dry? What if there's an awning over top of the street and the rain is just coming straight down rather than at an angle? What if the street is heading into a tunnel and it never gets wet no matter what direction the rain is coming from? This leads in to the biggest drawback of deductive logic. The strongest deductive argument in the entire universe is still only as strong as its weakest premise. The second major form of logic is referred to as induction. Induction is the sort of logic where you have a bunch of disjointed premises that all feed into the same conclusion, ultimately allowing you to support the conclusion. An example here would be, imagine a endless bowl of candy. I walk up to it and I want to know what flavor all of the red pieces of candy are. So I start eating them one at a time. I eat the first one and it's cherry. Second one, cherry. Third one, also cherry. And I do this into perpetuity until I've eaten 10,000 pieces of red candy, all of them cherry. That's a lot of candy. Don't eat that much in one sitting. From this, the conclusion would naturally be all pieces of red candy are cherry flavored. The strength of inductive logic is that it is directly tied to the world around you. Rather than taking the time to string the premises together, you just have your amalgamation of premises that allow you to draw a conclusion from them. This is incredibly important for things that we interact with on the daily, or hopefully not daily. Anybody who's ever touched a hot stove tells you that they didn't need to gather very many observations to come to their conclusion. Our ability to do this is kind of critical for our ability to function in either a superficial or a deep sense in our daily or longitudinal lives. That being said, I imagine that the pitfalls of inductive logic are pretty intuitive for most of us. When you base your conclusions off of observations, well, you can always get more observations. Going back to that bowl of candy, it might be the case that the 10,001st piece of candy is watermelon flavored, and by extension, we can't draw the conclusion that every piece of red candy is cherry anymore. You might be inclined to get around this by saying, well, it's just the overwhelming majority of red candy is cherry flavored, but even that doesn't necessarily hold up. We might eat another 10,001 and flip those odds over because all of the subsequent 10,001 were watermelon. Inductive logic can have entirely true premises, all of which feed into a conclusion appropriately, and have the conclusion still not be true. The first philosopher I want to talk about is a man who was named David Hume. He was active during the 18th century. This is around the time when modern science as we know it was really getting its feet under it, and he took a really deep interest in it. His primary question was pertaining to its use of deductive versus inductive logic. He wanted to examine which iteration it used, why it used that iteration, and if it had the ability to switch between them if at all possible. David Hume, as part of his work, came up with a couple of different ideas for how ideas and conclusions could be sorted. One of them he referred to as relations of ideas. These are concepts which are true by definition. An example of this might be that a circle is all points which are equidistant from a center point, or a square is 4 equal sides with 90 degrees separating each one. From these, you can logic out that there is no such thing as a square circle, a shape which has both the characteristics of being a square and a circle simultaneously. This is true if you know the definition of square and circle, and you don't need to appeal to anything else around you in order to get this far. The other type of idea is something he referred to as statements of fact. These are statements about the world around us. One of these might be that the moon appears as a circle in the night sky when it is full. In order to say this in a meaningful way, you do have to know what a circle means and apply it to the world around you. But it also involves looking up at the night sky at a particular time in the month. In order to make claims about the world around you, it has to be pertinent to something outside of something that you've cooked up in your own head. If anybody watching this is getting flashbacks to Descartes, that's probably because him and Hume were asking very similar questions. Descartes just wanted to think about whether or not he could prove anything existed aside from himself, and Hume was thinking about the applied question of how do we know anything about the world around us in a meaningful way. Hume is basically Descartes for people who aren't complete philosophy nerds. For Hume, and for modern science still today, if you're going to be talking about the world around you, you've moved on to statements of fact, at the very least in part, if not exclusively. This means that you have to rely on your observations to derive any conclusions. Observations being the basis for effectively inductive logic without fail. Hume tried to reason out whether or not it would be possible to start talking about the world around you using deductive logic without any induction. And the closest he got was this concept he refers to as the uniformity of nature. If nature has gone a certain way in the past, you can trust that it will do so in the future. By appealing to the uniformity of nature, it would be possible to safeguard a drawn conclusion from future contradictory observations, because you could just trust that those observations wouldn't happen. Why? Uniformity of nature. Now, David Hume did run into a problem when he tried to justify this, and it was something that caused him No end of grief, really. Immediately after having come up with this concept, David Hume realized that the only way he'd ever be able to justify the uniformity of nature would be by thinking back at all the times that it has worked out for him. He'd tally up all of these examples of it going well, and then derive his conclusion from it that you can trust the uniformity of nature. If this sounds like induction to you, that's because it is. David Hume realized that no matter what, you're either going to be propping your arguments up with induction or chasing your own tail with induction to justify using induction in the first place. Consequently, his conclusion, and the conclusion that stands still today largely untarnished, is that induction in science is completely unavoidable. The question is, given the unavoidability of induction, where do we go from here, and how do we manage it to know that we're concluding things that are actually based in reality? The next philosopher I'm going to mention was named Karl Popper. He was interested in proving that science was a fundamentally deductive process. While the overwhelming consensus is that he wasn't successful on that count, he nevertheless had a lot of very good thought on how science is conducted that persists and has influence today. Central to his thought process on the matter was this concept referred to as falsification. Falsification is the notion that a researcher's job is to prove their hypotheses wrong. This might feel counterintuitive for a lot of folks, but it makes some sense in the context of science. If somebody has been contemplating a hypothesis long enough that it's risen to the point where they want to test it, they've probably grappled with the possibility that the hypothesis is correct. It's more likely to have slipped their mind not just that their hypothesis might be false, but also what the world would look like if it were false. If you've ever heard of a null hypothesis before, falsification is where that comes from. By setting falsifiability as the standard, the researcher not only forces themselves to think that maybe they're wrong, but they force themselves to look for that wrongness and rule it out. It's really easy to set up an experiment to prove yourself right and then get that result. But by doing the opposite, you make your ideas all the easier to disprove, and by extension, more likely to be true when you fail to disprove them. It's also worth mentioning that pseudoscience is delineated by not being falsifiable. This actually comes directly from Popper himself. He indicated that no matter what set of observations a pseudoscientist gets, he will never reject his claims. This is to be contrasted with science, which does reject its claims when a hypothesis is falsified. This is particularly important given that at the time that this was being done, lifting scientific lingo was enough to get you some validity in the eyes of people who weren't familiar with science. And it's an unfortunate practice that continues still today. Now, the question then becomes, what are the limits on falsification? Popper wanted to plug falsification into an argumentative form that allowed him to prove that it was the basis for deduction in the field of science. The argument was set up as premise 1, if I fail to falsify my hypothesis, then I should accept my hypothesis. Premise 2, via an experiment, I have failed to falsify my hypothesis. Conclusion, therefore, I should accept my hypothesis. Now, putting aside a potential false dichotomy between complete rejection versus complete acceptance of a hypothesis, there are a few considerations here that really do undermine the claim to deductive standards. It's mainly in the form of that second premise. Through an experiment, I have failed to falsify my hypothesis. Well, this begs the question, what is an experiment? In an experiment, you have an independent variable that you, the researcher, are moving, and then you observe the outcome on some dependent variable. Now, the real question becomes, is it ever the case that you only have one independent variable? And further, there are multiple independent variables. Are you aware of all of them? Science, it turns out, is not like making ramen. It's rather like a Thanksgiving dinner. Sometimes, when you're putting the turkey in the oven, it turns out that the casserole has been burning for the past 15 minutes. Even the most basic scientific experiment is making an assumption that the universe is static around the experiment. Or if it's not static, then at the very least what's going on in it doesn't have any effect on the experiment itself. The unfortunate truth of the matter is that's a standard that you can never prove. You have to look at prior experiments, see that they've turned out the same, and start drawing the conclusion that there's nothing going on to influence the experiment itself. If this sounds like the uniformity of nature and induction all over again, that's because it is. The question then becomes, what are the assumptions that we're making around any given experiment? Why did we make those assumptions? And how do we know that we can trust them? The last philosopher I'm going to talk about was a guy named Thomas Kuhn. He didn't actually get his start in philosophy, he was a historian of science. I will say that the most common route to philosophy, at least in my experience, is accidental. So, Kuhn's in good company there. Thomas Kuhn noticed that looking back at science as a whole, it had these cycles. There'd be these long periods of normal science. He described it as science as puzzle solving. And every once in a while, these would be punctuated by a brief period of upheaval, followed by more normal science. Central to how Kuhn thought about science as a whole was the concept of a scientific paradigm. A paradigm is basically the set of assumptions, theories, and experimental methods that a given field of science uses for some chunk of time. It turns out that without a paradigm, it's not very possible for a lot of science to actually take place. Most of the time, when it's a group of people working together, you need a common set of terminology, and science is no exception. By having the same jargon to pull from, using the same experimental methods, asking similar questions, scientists are able to work as a disparate group that actually moves an entire field forward at once. If it wasn't for a paradigm, you'd have a bunch of different, completely distinct threads of inquiry without any guarantee that they would come together in any meaningful way. And I imagine that many of you watching this would be able to get the sense that paradigms have a bit of a drawback in that they have a tendency to be unflexible. That really does turn out to be the case, and consequently, as science progresses within the confines of one paradigm, anomalies start to pop up, observations or results that the current paradigm just can't explain. As these build up more and more, the researchers in the paradigm itself become more and more frustrated with their overarching assumptions and have to reconsider them. Eventually, this boils over and leads to what Thomas Kuhn referred to as a scientific revolution. A revolution is when one paradigm just is not tenable anymore, and so the community as a whole decides to throw it out and get a new paradigm. The new one will ostensibly be better in that it can explain any existing anomalies and move the entire field forward in a meaningful way. There are a couple of drawbacks to this cyclical nature of science punctuated by revolutions. The first one is something referred to as Kuhn loss. Sometimes an older paradigm had a bit of information in it that actually has a lot of explanatory power for something that science is currently grappling with. But because it's part of an old paradigm and nobody's discussing it anymore, nobody has it in mind to apply to this hard to explain piece of information. It's pretty easy to accidentally throw out the baby with the metaphorical bathwater when you're moving from one paradigm to another. You also have to grapple with the fact that there's a certain degree of arbitrariness with regards to when a revolution is initiated and in what way it gets resolved. You need to hit a certain critical mass of frustration with a current paradigm, but after that, getting enough researchers to slam their hand down on the metaphorical big red scientific revolution button isn't always as straightforward as you might think. It isn't subject to any systemic evaluation, it just sort of happens as a social phenomenon. Furthermore, once the paradigm has been rejected and the revolution is in progress, and different paradigms are being compared to each other to decide which one will become the new paradigm, there's no system to ensure that the new paradigm will be the optimal one. It is possible, through different forces, to take a suboptimal paradigm forward as the result of a revolution. While this lack of a systematic approach with regard to paradigms is more of a bug than a feature when it comes to science, it does bear pointing out that this wasn't some conscious decision that scientists made. It's rather just the end result of wanting to all talk to each other and have a meaningful conversation on that front, followed up by getting frustrated when that conversation starts to stall out. While the creation of paradigms really does not seem to have been intentional on anybody's part, it seems to be an unavoidable side product to the scientific process itself whenever a group of people come together to do it as a whole. It's difficult to discuss paradigms and revolutions without accidentally ascribing a little bit of intentionality to them, but that really isn't the case. Thomas Kuhn noticed them well after they'd been occurring for a long time. They seem to just be a natural outcome of having a group of people asking the sorts of questions that scientists ask. And given how science is practiced today, it does seem that until a completely new system gets pulled up, they are rather unavoidable. The day-to-day practice of science really does come out looking like puzzle solving via falsification. That being said, these are informed by wider paradigms that make sure you're asking these questions in such a way that you can compare them to other folks who are asking similar questions. Without that, there wouldn't be individual fields, and consequently, science as we know wouldn't exist. And I do think it's worth pointing out that this approach has worked very well for us so far. We're able to answer questions very quickly, build up large bodies of knowledge, and grapple with very complex ideas that otherwise we'd really struggle to in a meaningful way. I'm not sure if I'll be returning to philosophy after this video, or any of these three guys in particular. It really depends if the interest is there on my part or on the part of any viewers who decide to come along with the channel for the ride. I will say that I find it a very interesting topic, but it's very difficult to find its applications, and consequently, it doesn't hold my interest as easily as the more salient aspects of science. That being said, my next few videos on this subject will be dealing with the mechanics of science and why we choose the methods that we do.